Everybody, welcome. I think we have a few people coming in right now, but since it is top of the hour, we can get started, at least with a introduction and kind of get into things. Thank you all for coming for this November's Safe Connection. We have Dr. Michele Buonanduci here that will be sharing some of her work. Michele is a postdoctoral research working jointly with the Nature Conservancy and the University of Washington. She is interested in harnessing quantitative methods to address both fundamental and applied ecological questions. She completed her PhD in the Quantitative Ecology and Resource Management program at the University of Washington, where her research focused on understanding the causes and consequences of forest disturbances across a range of spatial scales. She currently is working to quantify how fire regimes are changing across the Western US and to better understand the implications of those changes for Pacific salmon populations. She is supporting two collaborative interdisciplinary research efforts with the Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative and a Science for Nature and People partnership. Before we get started, I wanted to let you all know too, we ask that you keep your videos off as well as your mics until the end of the presentation, where we can then take questions and answers, questions and comments for Michele. All right, I will leave the floor to you, Michele.
Awesome. Thanks, Angie, for the introduction and the invitation to be here today. And hi, everyone. Welcome. Happy Monday afternoon. So my goal today is to tell you a bit about my career trajectory so far, and then to give you an overview of some of the types of research I have done and currently do. I'm a postdoctoral researcher currently, as Angie said. So I'm still an early career scientist, and I have always found it really interesting and helpful to hear about how other people have navigated and are navigating their careers in the sciences. So that's what I'm hoping to share with you today. Okay, so starting at the very beginning, I grew up in the Northeast United States in Massachusetts, surrounded by forests that look something like this. And growing up in this part of the country, fire was not remotely on my radar, but I spent a lot of time in the woods, and was very interested in trees and forest systems. I loved and still love the fall foliage in New England, and hiking around in the woods there was a big part of my childhood, which definitely led to the interest and connection I feel for forests today. I did my undergraduate studies at Boston University. I studied environmental science and was housed within the geography department there. So it was there that I initially found an interest in things like remote sensing and GIS. I had the opportunity to gain my very first research experience as an undergrad working with Dr. Nathan Phillips. I spent a summer with Dr. Phillips mapping an invasive tree called the Tree of Heaven throughout the city, and measuring how it was taking up carbon across a sort of urban to rural gradient. After wrapping up my bachelor's, I had a sort of general idea that I wanted to pursue graduate school at some point, but I wasn't really sure in what, and I wanted to get some work experience first. So I stayed in Boston, and took a job with Arcadis, which is a large international consulting company that does a lot of environmental work in the United States. I started working with a team focused on exposure and risk assessment for human health and wildlife at sites with high levels of environmental contaminants. So I supported data analysis and helped generate reports that were submitted to the EPA and other regulatory agencies. Initially, I thought, okay, I'll do this for a year and then I'll go back to school. But then I realized I was learning a lot on the job, and really enjoying the work. So 1 year turned into two, turned into three. Eventually, I started working on more complex modeling projects. So things like population modeling and habitat suitability assessments, and was given the opportunity to transfer within Arcadis out to their Denver, Colorado office. So this was a really big change for me, both personally and professionally. It was my first time living outside of the Northeast. And for the first time, I had the opportunity to live and work out west, which just opened my eyes in so many ways. Suddenly, I was working in these wide open landscapes and thinking about land management and land restoration really on a different scale than I had been before. And so eventually, as I was nearing 5 years or so working with Arcadis, I began to seriously contemplate grad school again. I knew at this point, I had a better sense of my interests and goals at this point. I knew I really enjoyed quantitative analysis and modeling, and that I wanted to do something related to ecology. So these somewhat broad interests of mine brought me to the Quantitative Ecology and Resource Management program at the University of Washington, which is a really unique interdisciplinary program. I came to UW with the goal of getting a master's degree in this quantitative ecology program. And shortly, I joined Dr. Brian Harvey's lab. Brian is a forest disturbance ecologist. And so at this point, I knew I was interested in forests and spatial processes. And while I'd spent a few years living out west at this point, fire activity had actually been pretty low in Colorado during the years that I lived there. So fire still wasn't really on my radar in a big way. In any case, I started in on a master's project working with Brian, which actually took me back to Colorado to study mountain pine beetle outbreak in some long-term forest monitoring plots in the Front Range of the Colorado Rockies. So here I am with my lab mate, Dr. Jenna Morris, at the Fraser Experimental Forest, where we were both collecting data for our master's research at the time. And here's just a figure from some of my master's work where I was really digging into the sort of individual tree scale mortality outcomes resulting from mountain pine beetle outbreak, and thinking about how surviving trees were responding to that outbreak. And through this process of conducting fieldwork and really seeing a research project through to its conclusion, I discovered just how much I enjoy doing research. So back at UW, I wrapped up my master's and decided to stay on for a PhD, which I started in January 2020. Initially, as I was developing my dissertation, I was thinking it would be a continuation of some of my master's work and digging deeper into bark beetle outbreaks and other biotic disturbances across the West, which it ended up being just that to some extent. But then the Labor Day fires in Washington and Oregon occurred later that summer. And so, for the first time in recent memory, for most people living in this region, the wet forests west of the Cascade Crest in Washington and Oregon were burning in a really big way. Seattle actually had some of the worst air quality in the world for a couple of days while those fires were burning that summer. So, not long after this, inspired in part by my own personal experience of living through these fires, as well as the research opportunities that they opened up, I began actively studying fire and building out a dissertation that was more focused on fire. And I'll tell you more about my dissertation research in a little bit when I get into that portion of my talk. But what I do want to highlight here is that most of my PhD research would not have been possible without funding from the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center and the Joint Fire Science Program. So the federal funding and training opportunities offered through these programs were pretty instrumental in making my PhD research possible. So as I was wrapping up my PhD and thinking about what was next, I knew a couple of things. I knew I wanted to stay in Washington. I also had a strong interest in working on more applied science and really had my sights set on working for either an agency or an NGO. I was really fortunate in that around that time, the Nature Conservancy in Washington was looking to take on a postdoc through their partnership with the University of Washington to help with some modeling work. Topically, the postdoc was somewhat new territory for me. They were looking for someone with quantitative skills who could model salmon responses to forest restoration on the Washington coast. And I was really excited about this position because I wanted to continue branching out in my research. I saw it as a new challenge and an opportunity to think about forest ecology and forest management in a new way, not just from the perspective of tree mortality and tree recovery, which really had been my focus up to that point, but also thinking about the ways that changes in forests affect streams and aquatic organisms. I think traditionally many people see postdoc positions as sort of a necessary step on the path to pursuing a faculty position, which for many people they are. But for me, it was an opportunity to get my foot in the door with an NGO that I really respected, and to broaden my research skills and my professional network. So this was initially a 1-year postdoc position, but in that time, I worked with my advisor, Dr. Eileen Ettinger, to apply for funding through the Science for Nature and People Partnership Program, which would extend my position and fund a working group focused on the intersection of forests, salmon, and fire. During that same time, I also had the opportunity to start working with Brian Harvey again in a new role through a research collaborative called the Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative. So I'll tell you a little bit more about each of these initiatives later, but as far as the sort of trajectory of my career path, all of that brings me to where I am today. Okay, so now I'm going to give you an overview of some of my research, past and present. I'll start by talking a bit about my PhD research, which again was really focused on forests and fire. Then I'll tell you a little bit about some of my early postdoc research working with the Nature Conservancy, where I was focused on forest and fish. And then I'll give you an overview of some of my current postdoctoral research, bringing all of those pieces together, thinking about forests, fire, and fish. So part 1, forests and fire. So the big picture motivation for a lot of my PhD work was the fact that as climate continues to warm, some of the largest increases in area burned are actually expected to occur in regions where fire activity has historically been limited by cool, wet climate. So in these regions, there is an abundance of fuel that can carry fire, and warming and drying climate is expected to make ignitions more likely. So one such region is northwestern Cascadia, which is the region west of the Cascade Crest in Washington and northern Oregon. And in this region, wildfires have historically been fairly infrequent, but when they occur, they tend to be large and severe. And this region has been the focus of a number of ongoing research projects over the last several years. So as a PhD student, I was part of a collaborative research effort with a number of partners who are listed here, who all shared the goal of better understanding the characteristics of wildfire in this region. So thinking of the increasing potential for wildfire in northwestern Cascadia, increasing drought, drying out those really abundant fuels, plus increasing ignitions across the landscape are generally expected to result in more frequent fires throughout western Washington and Oregon. Most of those fires are actually expected to be small to moderate in size. However, we know that the largest fires in this region tend to occur during extreme weather events when strong, dry east winds coincide with summer drought. So this was the case with the 2020 Labor Day fires, which are shown burning here. And so it's still really an open question as to whether the frequency of these types of very large wind-driven fire events might increase in the future. And while it's important to consider the size of future fires, it's just as important to think about what the spatial structure of those fires might look like, because the size and also the shape of high severity burn patches can really set the template for post-fire forest recovery. This is primarily because the interior portions of high severity patches can be really far from surviving live trees following fire and therefore really far from potential seed sources. So, for tree species that rely on wind dispersed seed for regeneration, those regeneration rates can drop off pretty sharply with increasing distance to the nearest unburned seed source. Because of this, large high severity patches are where management intervention is often most needed. So things like replanting with tree seedlings. At the same time, these areas are also locations where complex early successional habitat forms. And this habitat is really rich in terms of plant species and wildlife species diversity. And supports a range of culturally important plant species in the northwestern Cascadia region, like huckleberry. So all of this is to say that patterns of burn severity are important to anticipate because they affect a wide range of ecosystem services. When it comes to anticipating patch sizes and shapes that we might expect with future fires, the challenge is that spatial patterns of burn severity are really difficult to predict for any given landscape. That's because they depend on a complex mixture of factors, including things like vegetation and fuel structure, topography, and weather at the time of burning, which can be highly variable. More generally, however, thinking about the spatial structure of fires, you can imagine that as fires increase in size, the potential or capacity for large high severity patches also naturally increases. So, if we have a sense of what fire size distributions might look like, say on a regional scale, these spatial properties of fires can then be used to anticipate potential fire effects. And so this was one of the primary things I explored as part of my PhD dissertation. So describing the relationship between fire size and expected patterns of burn severity, and then developing a framework and approach for simulating those burn severity patterns given projections for fire size distributions in a region. And if I had to boil it down, the key finding from a lot of this work is that even if total burned area in a given region stays the same, shifts in fire size distributions towards larger fires will lead to increasingly large high severity patches with interior areas that are increasingly far from live seed sources following fire. So as an extreme example, here is an 80,000 hectare fire. This is the Beachy Creek fire, which was one of the 2020 Labor Day fires that burned in Oregon. And here is a 1,000 hectare fire for comparison. And you can imagine that 80,000 total hectares burning in one very large fire event like Beachy Creek is going to have very different consequences for forest structure in a region as compared to that same total area burning in 80 smaller fires like this one. So anticipating, understanding and anticipating these spatial properties of fires has really important implications for planning how we might manage forests moving forward. Okay, so pivoting now to part two, some of my early postdoctoral research working with the Nature Conservancy, which was focused on forests and fish. So the focus and motivation for this work is the Ellsworth Creek watershed, which is a preserve in Southwest Washington that has been owned and managed by the Nature Conservancy for 25 years now. This watershed was formerly managed for timber production and was cut over several times. But since the early 2000s, the watershed has been under TNC's management, who have focused on restoring old growth forest structure and improving wildlife habitat and watershed health. For TNC, they really see this as what they call a living laboratory, where they are both implementing restoration projects as well as monitoring and testing for restoration success. And Ellsworth Creek, which you can see in this aerial photo here, importantly, is used by several species of Pacific salmon for spawning and reproduction. Now, Pacific salmon, as you may be aware, are broadly in need of restoration action. This is due to a wide range of factors, including things like habitat loss and degradation, barriers to fish passage, detrimental fisheries management practices, and increasingly also climate change. And as you may also know, the salmon life cycle is really complex. So, salmon rely on habitats ranging from streams to estuaries to oceans to complete their life cycle. So, we know that what we do on land through habitat restoration and land management can potentially benefit salmon by improving salmon spawning habitat and juvenile survival. But we also know that climate change is going to put pressure on salmon across the board, really at each stage of their life cycle. So it's difficult to evaluate how our land management might be affecting salmon without taking climate change into effect. So, with that context, and in light of all of the restoration work out at the Ellsworth Preserve, the Nature Conservancy was really interested in understanding this question, which is what is the potential for forest management to increase the resilience of salmon populations to climate change? And so we addressed this question using an integrated population modeling approach for chum salmon. We partnered with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife for this work. They monitor the salmon populations in Ellsworth Creek, as well as within two other watersheds within the Willapa Basin, which again is in Southwest Washington, as you can see in the inset map. So these other two watersheds are owned primarily by private industrial timber companies, and so their management over the last 25 years has continued to be focused on timber production. So in our modeling, we were able to harness information from across this basin to try to understand how salmon are responding to different types of forest management at this watershed scale. Now, without getting into too many of the gory details of our modeling work, we found evidence that a mosaic of habitat conditions affect the productivity of salmon in this study region. So conditions from those happening out in the ocean, things like sea surface temperature and coastal upwelling processes, to conditions in the estuary, namely the availability of intact native habitats, to watershed scale forest structure surrounding the streams where salmon spawn. And this was one of our key findings, the fact that amidst all of the population variability and the different factors that salmon are experiencing and responding to throughout their very complex life cycle, forest structural complexity had a measurable positive effect on the productivity of these populations. We were able to use our models and the information we had learned to project population dynamics into the future under different climate and forest management scenarios. So, breaking this figure down for you, on the y-axis here, we have the probability of local population collapse. So higher values here mean a higher chance of the population going locally extinct by the end of the century. On the x-axis, we have climate scenarios represented by different climate models, and these are generally arranged with greater ocean warming scenarios to the left side of the graph here. And then the colors here represent the two forest management scenarios we looked at. So we looked at an industrial harvest scenario and an ecological forest management scenario. And what you can see here in this figure is the buffering effect that choosing an ecological forest management strategy can offer over more timber-focused, industrial timber-focused management in terms of offsetting some of those negative effects from climate change. So this study has added to a sort of growing body of evidence that climate change has and will continue to put pressure on salmon populations. Fortunately, this study also demonstrates that forest restoration has the potential to increase the resilience of salmon populations to ongoing climate change. And this work has gained a lot of interest not only from the forest managers and restoration practitioners within the Nature Conservancy, but also from our partner organizations across the region who are interested in implementing restoration projects of their own and trying to figure out, whether and where those restoration efforts will have real impact, or those who have already implemented restoration projects and want to evaluate whether those projects have been successful. And that has been, I will just say, really gratifying to me personally to be able to see this sort of direct link between science and action on the ground coming out of this work. Okay, part three, bringing all of these themes together in some of my current research. So currently, I support two interdisciplinary and collaborative research groups. One is called the Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative. This is a research program designed to accelerate scientific discoveries that we hope will enhance forest resilience and wildfire decision making. And then the other is the Science for Nature and People Partnership Working Group, which is focused on integrating forest management for fire resilience with salmon restoration efforts. So getting into a bit more detail on each of these. Again, first we have the Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative. So this is a research program that brings together a pretty large network of collaborators working on fire science. And we're all organized into these 5 different working groups. And I won't get into the details on each of these, but ultimately the goal of all of these groups is to understand how to live with wildfire on the landscape in the West in a sustainable way. I am a member of the Tracking Forests and Fire Working Group. And in this group, we're using remote sensing techniques to explore a range of different questions, such as how and where fires are changing in their frequency, size, and severity, how forest structure and cover are changing in response to that, and what factors are driving all of these changes. And all of this information we believe will help fire managers and other stakeholders continue to make informed decisions as fire and forests continue to change. Next, there is the Science for Nature and People Partnership Working Group. So the motivations for this working group are first, again, that salmon populations have declined dramatically and are under increasing pressure. We recognize that salmon have evolved in and are adapted to fiery landscapes. Fire is not inherently a bad thing for salmon. However, fire-salmon relationships are complex, as illustrated by this flowchart over here to the right. And so it's not clear how changing fire regimes might affect salmon moving forward. And then furthermore, restoration planning for salmon and for forest fire resilience are often really siloed within distinct policies and agencies. So we're developing a range of different science products to address these challenges, ranging from synthetic research papers to focal analyses to help build up the evidence base in this space, as well as sort of non-technical articles and other products sharing stories about the intersection of forest, fire, and fish. And I will just say that working in these types of collaborative settings with people from lots of different backgrounds, working for different organizations, and bringing different expertise and perspectives to the table has been incredibly rewarding and challenging, and also really fun. It has definitely opened my eyes to new ways of thinking about and doing science, It has connected me with colleagues who I hope to continue collaborating with throughout my career. And so I really want to give a shout out here to both of these wonderful groups of people who I currently have the privilege of working with on a daily basis. And the last thing I want to do is tell you a bit about two research projects I'm currently working on. Um, One with each of these teams sort of falling under each of these umbrellas. So the first ongoing project I want to share with you is under the umbrella of the Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative. And in this project, I am working to develop an ecological burn severity atlas for Western US forests. So, as you all know, satellite burn severity indices are extraordinarily valuable for understanding and tracking fire effects across broad areas and regions. These indices estimate the magnitude of fire-induced vegetation change by comparing pre and post-fire vegetation greenness, often using Landsat or Sentinel imagery. Because the indices themselves are unitless and not directly interpretable, they are typically classified into ordinal, low, moderate, and high severity classes. More recently, satellite indices have been statistically related to the Composite Burn Index, or CBI, which is a semi-quantitative, ordinal, field-based index of burn severity. And Sean Parks and colleagues have developed a framework to translate maps of satellite indices to maps of CBI for any given fire event within the satellite record, which has been a huge step forward for burn severity mapping. However, although CBI is more ecologically interpretable than satellite indices, it is still an aggregate index that does not directly translate to specific ecological changes on the ground. So we want to take things another step further. Our goal in this project is to create continuous maps of interpretable on the ground fire effects. So things like basal area and stem mortality, ground surface charring, bole charring, and changes in canopy cover. And we want to do this using those satellite indices in combination with covariates that might modulate the relationship between what a satellite is seeing and what is actually happening on the ground in terms of these different ecological changes. So to do this, we are harnessing a field-based burn severity data set consisting of 820 total field plots across northwestern US forests, collected either 1 or 2 years post-fire. And we were using this data set to develop statistical models connecting satellite indices of burn severity to each of these on-the-ground measures of burn severity. So here we have RDNBR on the x-axis of each of these panels and a different on-the-ground burn severity measure on the y-axis of each of these panels. So you can see that there are similar but distinct relationships between satellite indices, RDMBR in this case, and each of these different on-the-ground measures. Again, we're also evaluating whether and how things like pre-fire forest structure, climate, and topographic characteristics mediate these relationships and sort of improve model performance. We're using these models again to develop an ecological burn severity atlas for northwestern US forests. So for each fire event within the satellite record, we are translating satellite index maps. So here we have a map of RDMBR, translating those to maps of these 7 distinct on-the-ground ecological burn severity measures. And I'm just showing 3 here as an example. We have basal area mortality on the top, bowl charring in the center, and then ground surface charring on the bottom. But you can see from these three examples how these burn severity maps differ qualitatively across these three ecological measures. Importantly, we're also generating spatially explicit estimates of uncertainty to really capture and convey the uncertainty in the relationships between what a satellite sees and what is happening on the ground. So here I have the best estimate from our models for each of these three measures. And then on the left, a lower bound estimate, and on the right, an upper bound estimate for each of them. Finally, we are also deriving maps expressing the probability that each burn severity measure exceeds management relevant thresholds. So in this case, we have maps expressing the probability that each of these three burn severity measures exceeds 0.75 or 75% tree mortality or charring, which is a threshold that is frequently used by researchers and managers to define high severity fire. So in the coming year, we will be making this atlas publicly available, again, consisting of ecologically calibrated and interpretable maps of on-the-ground fire effects. We believe this atlas will offer many new opportunities to explore the causes, ecological consequences, and management implications of fire across the West. And one of those opportunities I am personally excited about is the other ongoing project I want to share with you, which falls under the Science for Nature and People Partnership Working Group umbrella. And in this project, I am working to characterize riparian burn severity across the state of Washington. So this project is really motivated by the fact that post-fire stream conditions and aquatic communities, including salmon, are really sensitive to riparian burn severity. And furthermore, riparian forests can and do differ from adjacent upland forests in lots of different ways that lead to differences in both fire behavior and fire effects. So the question we want to address in this project is, under what conditions do riparian forests burn more or less severely than adjacent uplands? As a general framework, you can imagine there are three possible outcomes in terms of riparian versus upland burn severity. Riparian areas can burn less severely than adjacent upland forests, similarly to adjacent uplands, or more severely than adjacent uplands. This first scenario is probably what you might assume happens most frequently. So this is where riparian areas burn less severely than adjacent uplands due to factors such as cooler, moister microclimate conditions, less flammable vegetation, and saturated soils. There are also many cases in which riparian areas burn similarly to adjacent uplands, particularly when severe fire weather overrides some of the bottom-up drivers that might otherwise modulate or yet reduce burn severity in riparian areas relative to uplands. And then finally, there are cases where riparian areas can actually burn more severely than adjacent uplands. Typically in cases where fuel abundance is higher in riparian areas than uplands, or where steep riparian corridors serve as quote unquote chimneys or corridors for fire spread. And this scenario here is of particular interest in the Pacific Northwest and in Washington in particular, where fuel loads in riparian forests can often be higher than adjacent uplands, not only due to natural factors, but due to forest practice rules that limit active management, including fuels reduction treatments in the riparian zone. So in these cases, there is concern that riparian forests have the potential to burn more severely than adjacent uplands when wildfires do occur. So just as a visual example to further motivate this work, this here is an aerial image of a forested area up in north central Washington. And this is an image captured prior to fuels reduction treatments and prior to a fire that would subsequently occur in this area. Here's another image, still prior to the fire, but post fuels reduction treatments. So you can see the untouched strip of dense forest along the riparian corridor here. And then this third image is taken post-fire. And here you can really see how that strip of dense riparian forest burned pretty severely in this fire, and potentially more severely than some of the surrounding areas. Just another photograph this time to further motivate this work. This photo is also taken in north central Washington, and this shows a really striking pattern of high burn severity running up these steep riparian drainages. So this project is still in fairly early stages, but just to give you a sense of where we're going, we are using the Ecological Burn Severity Atlas that I just told you about, along with a suite of other geospatial data sets. Within each burned catchment, within Washington, we are determining whether and how riparian burn severity differed from upland burn severity. And then we'll be working to identify those conditions under which riparian forests tend to burn more or less severely than uplands. So really operationalizing that framework that I shared with you in that table earlier. And all of this we really hope will inform forest practice rules and the way that we manage forests in Washington. Okay, so some closing thoughts. And I thought I would close by just sharing some things that I really enjoy about my current work and sort of where my career has taken me thus far. So, like I said earlier, I really have enjoyed working in collaborative spaces where people are bringing different knowledge and expertise to the table. I also really enjoy working sort of across the fundamental to applied science gradient. I think both flavors of science are really crucial and important. On the more implied side of the spectrum, I enjoy producing actionable, user-informed science products. And then just generally thinking about how fire and other forest disturbances are connected to different ecosystem processes. So I've loved working at this intersection of fire, forests, water, and fish. And while I don't really know what's next, I still have another year left in my postdoc position. I hope to continue doing more of all of these things as I continue on in my career. And with that, well, I'm happy to take questions and maybe just open up a conversation with you all. And I have my email here, so please don't hesitate to reach out.